right, thank you so much. Thank you. It's kind of a tradition here. Every year I've got the technical glitch at the very beginning of the, give you good pressure, good stress to start it up, so that's good. Thank you so much for attending this conference. I can see sometimes, you know, it's like 4 p.m. You're like, why on earth would I hear about a law lecture in the Paris Space Week? You should be other place enjoying the other booths, but yeah, you're here. You're here because you know, you understand how law is important in our sector. So, of course, when I talk about the space deal, you should take it. But as you can see, it's kind of a cliche stuff, but conditions may apply. And if you're here, is that because you know that in the space industry especially, conditions are super important when you are negotiating contracts, when you are negotiating deals, and also when you are asking for regulatory permits, such as launch licenses, frequency licenses. That's what we're going to talk today, not in a boring way, but to have an interaction with you guys. What is important for you is to express your concern and trying to have a conversation over here. So, first question for you. I hope we have a spare mic for the audience. Why do we need law for the space activities for you? Oh, thank you so much. Awesome. So is anybody in the room has an idea on this? Why do you need law in the space industry? Because, come on guys, it's a technical field. Why do we need lawyers, according to you? Any question? Any philosophical feeling about this? Come on. Sir.
Presumably because it's people's lives involved.
You're right. It's a hazardous activity. It's a very dangerous activity, and people's lives depend on it. So we need to take care of liability. We need to protect the project and protect the people. Good. Other point. Why do we need law in the space activities? Protect people.
There is a lot of money involved.
Exactly.
And there is a lot of risk involved. And you have a lot of regulations from frequency to debris across the whole industry.
So exactly, a lot of risk, a lot of regulation, a lot of money at stakes, because going to space is not cheap for now. Who else? We're talking about protecting life, protecting assets. Lady?
We need law in space for regulation of space activities, protection of the Earth, protection of space. We have different countries with different agendas, and so making sure that space launches don't crash into each other, orbital natures don't crash into each other, so everyone's in line of how to respect astronauts, the Earth, and our future space activities.
Awesome, thank you so much, because with these three answers, we have pretty much the three parameters of space law. Protecting life, protecting people on Earth, protecting assets, and also maintaining good international relationships. Space law and space legal activities at a larger scale is a mix between private activities, but also bigger agenda. So when you are a space actor and you are entering into a space deal, it's not only two companies going into each other. It's a company signing a deal with another one, with the government giving regulation, giving permits, and with other parties at stake. The general public, it can be other parties, other governments, other agencies. So that's something bigger than the deal itself. So that's why we need law to regulate space activities, because it involves way more than just a deal. First thing first, and especially in outer space, we deal with uncertainty. As you know, of course, space projects, they last for years. It's very long projects, so of course we don't even know what's going to happen in 2 months. So imagine in 5 years, when we are negotiating launch deal, we need to schedule 1-2 years ahead. So that's a huge risk of uncertainty. So that's why we are doing contracts, that's why we are doing regulation, in order to mitigate this uncertainty, because uncertainty is indeed a risk. And also, and that's echo the answer that you did regarding the regulation between governments, that the purpose of this is to establish trust. We need to have trust with each other, because the space programs, space projects are so long, and they involve so many financial assets, technical assets, lives sometimes, so we need to trust each other. And in order to get this trust, the best way, even if we try to be good people, but the best way to keep trust on the longer term is to write it down in a contract. And that is why we always need contract in space deals. So, I'm not going to bother you with the details and the technicalities, but sorry, space law is twofold. As I mentioned, you have the contract law, or the general law that applies to the deal as a company. And then you have another layer, governmental. All the government that impose to you launch authorization, the authorizations to act as an operator, and if you want to have frequencies. That's the big parameters that you need to be careful about. That's why these two wheels, as you can see, they are working together. Space law on a larger scale and contract law. That means when you are negotiating a contract, you are also negotiating your authorization. So that's why you need to be careful, and we'll see that later. When you are negotiating your contract, you're committing also to take sometimes authorization from the government, and that impacts the contract itself. So that's something you need to be very careful in the space industry. Because as I said, in the space industry, you have two key parameters. The first one, and the most important one, which is paradoxical, is not the contract itself. That's the regulatory part. Because if you're not allowed to take part of the space activities, well, there's no deal. The deal is dead. Every time, I know you guys, you saw plenty of space contract. If there is no, if you don't provide, if you don't commit to provide on time authorization, there is always a stipulation, a clause that says contract is void, or we don't launch you. Especially for those who are negotiating LSA. Every time on LSA, you have this killer provision that says, we need you to show authorization. If you don't have it, you don't go on the rocket with us. That's something super, super important. Again, long story short, space law is quite detailed, a lot of steps, a lot of stages on this. The most important one, and I'm not going to detail it, are indeed the treaties. As you mentioned earlier, space law is first an international law. It's a relation between the governments. And from this, a lot of regulation has been implemented progressively. You have, of course, the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, something very broad, very general. And then you have regional agreements. For instance, European Space Agency. It's a treaty. It's a regional treaty. And then you go down, you have the national space law. For instance, in France, the famous LOS, Loi sur les opérations spatiales, which is the legal text that allows you or not to become an operator and to be allowed to launch your space object and to have your space mission. So super important. And below that, you have the national regulations. The most famous in France is the famous RT, Réglementation Technique du CNES, which is the more detailed requirement extracting from the principle of the LOS. And below that, something quite interesting, which is the soft law. Soft law, it's something which is non-binding, but kinda binding because this is a reputation. This is good practice. This is the thing that you implement in order to be a better actor. For instance, space debris. We commit, because of the Réglementation Technique, in France at least, to decommission, but sometimes you can see guidelines from international organizations stating how to do that and which level of precision you are expected to have. This is not binding per se. This is standard, this is soft law. But super important in our industry because generally the approach is bottom up. What is in the industry as a practice, at the end of the day, eventually becomes a norm and a binding norm. If you have any question, of course, feel free to stop the presentation and just tell me that. Regarding the principles, and we can go later back on this. The space law has several main core principles. What is important to remember from this diagram is, for instance, the freedom of exploration and use. The very fact that you are able to send a rocket and to send a satellite in orbit come from this. Because the different states are part of an international treaty that acknowledges that there is a freedom to go in outer space, you, as a subject to the space, to the state, as a citizen, as a company registered within the jurisdiction of the state, you have the authorization to go there. So everything goes, as what we see before, through this diagram. It started by international liberties to going down your own authorization. And this authorization, again, is crucial in order for you to get a deal, to get a contract. Because if you don't have this regulatory authorization, there's no contract for you. Even if you sign the contract will not be enforced because you don't have this brick. So that's the very specificity of the space industry on this. Highly private with the contracts, but also highly regulated. Then another one principle which is very important, the principle of liability. You may think, okay, as you said before, huge stake, human life, financial assets, technology. What if? What if there is a problem? Internationally, well, the regime is quite simple. Everything that happened on Earth is, for instance, let's say a rocket falls down onto the ground and there is damages. There is a strict liability. That means that we don't have to prove there was a mistake, there was no error. You are liable. Let's say a state launch a rocket, the rocket falls down, the state is liable, strict liability. If there is a damage in outer space, let's say you're doing in-orbit servicing and something happens. In order to be liable, you have to prove that there was a willful misconduct. That's a huge difference. You have to prove that there was a fault. It's a little bit, it's a very different type of regime. Why this is important for you as an actor? That because you as an actor has to incorporate this risk in your own space deal. When you are signing a contract, you have this provision, very important provision, insurance. Especially if you're in France, for instance, you have to take a civil liability insurance because of this principle. So as you see again, this is the relation between the international norms and the national norms is there, and it's deepened, enshrined into your contract. So that's something you need to be very careful of. There is liability because your state is liable, and so are you. It's not, the state is not protecting you indefinitely. You have to be protected by insurance. And then something also very important that I want to point out, especially for those who are forward thinking, especially on the space resources, for instance, talking about non-appropriation. You can't appropriate space resources according to international treaties. But as you may know, there are a few states that have regulated the space resources regime. Our neighbor state, for instance, Luxembourg, now has a space law dedicated to space resources, meaning that if you extract space resources, that is yours. Well, it's not what they said. They said, you have a title of ownership. So as you can see, this is pretty much in contradiction with what's happening in international space law. But that also shows you one thing, is that space activities are really depends on the international relationship, as we said before, but also as what your national jurisdiction decides. Like, for instance, in Luxembourg, in some country, if you come back with a piece of the moon, if some resources from the moon or from an asteroid, the country may say, it's difficult for you to sell that because you don't own it. In Luxembourg or in the United States, that's a different story. So that's something that is important for you to keep in mind. What's in international law can slightly change in a national regime. So be careful on that. Not being too philosophical on this, but space law, as we said, it's something quite stable. It's here for a while. You see, first treaty in 1967, so that's kind of mature, but also it's evolving right now. And every year, I do a similar presentation in different conferences. But this year, I've added something very important, which is international uncertainty. Last year, when I was talking about space law, I was mentioning the crisis in Ukraine. And that shows now how our globalized economy has been impacted by this post-COVID plus Ukrainian crisis. And that is impacting now the contract. We are more thinking about force majeure. We are more thinking about what we call imprévision, which is a dramatic change of the economic circumstances, which is especially important when you are planning a several-year space program. You need to be careful about the costs, and if inflation goes out of control, the price that you decided in financial appendix may change. So that's something you need to be super careful about it. I very insist on this. When you have a SLA, when you are launching a request for proposal in order to launch a satellite eventually, be careful about this. International context is very changing, especially regarding your costs. So that's something you need to be very careful about. Also regarding your supply chain is super tense right now, so the contracts are really unstable on this. And a lot of provider, a lot of supplier, they want to include a provision in order to protect their own cost. So be careful of that. The other one are more traditional. In an international regime, we are facing aging treaties. As I was mentioning, the space resources, everything was very sci-fi in the 70s. Right now, it's becoming a reality. So we have to deal with that as space actors. We have to deal with an international law, which is aging, and the new practice and the new segment that are emerging now. Also, some other problems. How do we cope, especially when you are negotiating contracts between what is a new space and what is, we call that legacy space. No offense, of course, but legacy industry, they are more mature. They're used to very deep and very sophisticated industrial processes. New space company, they are raising capital. They are trying to elaborate a proof of concept. They are trying to go into a space program. So they are doing a lot of things at the same time. And they don't have the human resources in order to do so. So most of the time when you are negotiating with new space ventures, we need to take the legacy contracting processes and change them in order to accommodate, to put more flexibility on this. So that's something we need to take into account, especially when, I repeat, we have an international context which is very, very unstable. So that's something we need to be very careful. And in order to mitigate this uncertainty, negotiating the deal is super, super important, especially right now. The other one, you know them very, they are very important for the last 10 years at least. Debris crisis, we know that there is this debris crisis. We are trying to implement, as I was mentioning earlier, soft law mechanism in order to mitigate that. But we also have new technique in order to remediate to the existing problems. But again, this existing problem posing a big problem of liability. As I was mentioning, if you are performing an in-orbit service, which is basically a deorbiting of a debris, what if you create more debris? Who's going to be responsible? How do you appreciate the fault? So that's something you need to anticipate in a contract, and that's quite a tricky phase. Just a glimpse also about the other parameters. Sorry guys, there is a lot of parameters that you need to think when you are negotiating this space deal. Of course, the contract, how do we articulate the contract? Something quite complex, that we know. Corporate law, as I was mentioning, a lot of new space ventures, they are also raising capital at the same time. Some companies, they are signing for a launch agreement. They are also signing for a proof of concept, and also they are raising capital. So free thing in the same time, three things that are super strategic. So be careful on that. We're talking about tax, we're talking about human resources, especially at the moment right now. Human resources, it's very, very scarce resource. It's very difficult to find people in the industry. So be careful of your contracts, of the provision that you are putting into it, non-compete, confidentiality, etc., etc. IP and patent, indeed, that's the strategic problem that every innovative company has to face. In a nutshell, there's a decision for you guys to make. When you are especially a new space company, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep the secret like Coca-Cola did? Or do you going to protect it? But the trade with the society is that you have to spread the word about the technique. So that's something you need really to measure. And then you have more sector-specific regulation, like data protection, especially important for those working on the cloud, those working with Earth observation, those working with telecommunication. You have all the telecommunication industry regulation, and then, of course, export control. I put dispute resolution a little bit on the side, because we are a sector that doesn't really like to go to court. We rarely put provision stating that we're going to go to national courts, or we do that in order to do a strategy to, afraid the other party. But generally, we go to arbitration because we want confidentiality. But again, be careful to that because arbitration is very expensive. For those who are working in France and who are interested to invest in France, regarding the regulatory side of the space deal, two main actors that you need to know. Of course, the CNES. Who doesn't know the CNES? That's everything related to authorization is instructed by the CNES. And then if you need spectrum resources, you have to go to the INFR in order for you guys to coordinate with the International Telecommunication Union. That's basically it in a nutshell. So before going to this, I just want to ask you a question. what is the first thing that you're checking when you are reading legal documents? If you do. What is the first thing you do when you open the document? They send you an email, double click on the attachment, boring space stuff, contract, boom, what do you read?
Footnotes.
Footnote, oh yeah, very important, very important. What is the footnotes? What precisely in the footnotes? What section?
All the sections, and I don't know where you started, but you're speaking on space law, for instance. I'm currently chairing the Committee on Planetary Protection, so we're doing a lot on space law. And the first thing I do is I check all the definitions and all the footnotes.
Thank you. Definitions. Too often I see people, they're like, okay, definition, I don't care. I just go to the price, I gotta go to the milestones, and I go to the penalties. But be careful to the definition, especially when you have innovative, disruptive, technological contracts. Everything needs to be defined, even if it's boring. Definition, when we start negotiating the definition, every time space operators, they're like, oh, I didn't know that I had to define this, and actually I'm not really clear about what does that mean too. So that's when you go back internally and, okay, let's discuss it, let's define it. So good, definition. What else? What else do you check? Wow. So that was a good question. Okay. Few hints. That's the thing that you need to check. Very important. First things first. And that goes back to the very traditional NDA. I know that a lot of people, they are like, what the hell with NDAs? It's just a bunch of papers that we're signing. Why do we need that? Really, that's just boring stuff. We don't understand it. And if the guy is speaking about my secrets, what can I do? That's super important to think about confidentiality, especially in a space project. If you need to be confidential, we're talking about IP protection. So be careful about confidentiality and the scope of confidentiality. Again, especially if you are doing a service, because now we have a lot of new space delivering space services, no longer only material. What do you deliver? What is the format of what you are delivering? Be careful of that. You don't want to be at fault when negotiating it. Then, of course, traditionally the milestones. What is the rhythm of your space contract? When you're going to be paid? Because milestones are generally linked to payments. So be careful, of course, about that. Once again, was I mentioning earlier in the presentation, export control and regulatory. Be careful of that, because export control, generally, one of the party has a liability, has to commit to file all the documentation. And if they don't do that, that is a very important breach of the contract. So be careful of that. Damages, of course, if there is a cap, how do you cap that? IP, I'm sure everybody heard in his life, background IP, foreground IP, that is something that needs to be strictly negotiating. And I insist, at the very beginning of the contract. Too much, I see every time, oh, we don't really know what's going to happen in the contract, so let's decide IP later. No. You know what you're going to bring, you know what you want out, so please decide first what is the principle, at least, of the IP. And then, of course, if you are launching especially, be careful about the insurance. Something that looks like a details, jurisdiction. If there is a problem, where are you going to go? And more than that, what is the law that governs your contract? That is something super important, because that can change everything. If you are a French company dealing with US law, if there is a problem, you maybe don't want to go into the 9th district of California or the 7th district of Delaware or I don't know where. So that's something you'll be very careful of that, because the cost also associated to that can be very, very important. And then, last but not least, appendices. They all matter, even those who looks kind of technical or usual. Appendices are very important because they generally details what's in the body of the contract. So again, I repeat that, but that's the foundation of teaching stuff. Watch for the big points. Of course, specs. You're the space expert, so you know what you want to commit or not. So be careful of that. Indeed, the price, especially in this time where the price can be set as fixed, but can evolve because of, especially if you're an international contract, because of the currency that you're using, because of inflation, because of the evolution of the prices of the supply chain per se. So be careful of that. Payment term, sometimes we are like, okay, we pay 30 days, but what is the start? What is the kickoff of the right of remuneration? Sometimes this is not the same thing, so be careful of that. The schedule, of course, the performance, especially important now in our sector if we have software, if you are doing services, if you are doing SaaS services, you have not now a lot of space actors doing software as a service, you have SLAs. So be careful of these SLAs, the warranty, and of course, again, the liability cap. So, a few tips. Now we said that you need to take care to a lot of things. So don't get overwhelmed. There are a few tips that you can use in order to cope with this situation. The first thing first, this is quite of an old one, evaluate the relation that you have with all the countries involved now. Let's talk about Russia, because back in the day that was the hot topic. It is still right now, but now given the context, you have to be careful about all your partners if they are foreign. Be careful of that. You have to monitor also all the regulatory development that you have. The French laws may evolve. The réglementation technique in France will evolve too. That's happened in all the countries in the world right now. You have a lot of jurisdiction now adopting space regulation. So you need to be very careful of that at all. And then, of course, you have to be careful about all the France Relance plan, everything that you can get money in order to fund your new space ventures. You need to assess impact of what you are doing during the negotiation. And indeed, last but not least, even if you sign the contract, there is a way that you need to audit your contract, because the contract is a living organism. When you sign it, you don't put somewhere in a safe and say, okay, I forget it now. You need to audit it. Contract need to be negotiated all along, before signing, during signing, and post-signing. Because when the situation changes, you need to be able to discuss with a partner in order to evaluate the situation, especially if the situation becomes unsustainable for you. So that's something you need to be very aware of that. In a nutshell, what do we do when we audit contracts? Of course, we review the contract, and we review the contract vis-a-vis the geostrategic context of your contract and also the regulation. As I mentioned earlier, space legal regime are deeply linked with the regulation. It's not because it's not just a contract. The contract, as I mentioned earlier, is inserted into this hierarchy of norms, regional agreements, national norms. So you have to be careful on the evolution of the situation on this regard. Just a few words of advertisement before giving you the floor. Of course, that's a tradition. What is SPACEAVOCAT? SPACEAVOCAT is a law firm dedicated to space activities. The core mission is really to assist you guys in your space missions. It can be contract, it can be negotiating, it can be transactional, it can be raising money for your new space ventures. So if you have any question, feel free to ask me on this, and we're very happy to assist you on that. But now it's time for you to ask the question. And of course, if you need any information, you can scan the QR code, and you're going to take all the SPACEAVOCAT contact details. So guys, questions now. Sir.
When do you think that the soft law related to debris will be transformed into real law, and companies will really have to respect the debris elimination, which today is a big problem for all space projects? How do you see this process? How long and how difficult?
Well, thank you for this question. It's quite a tricky one, because the space debris, that's super sensitive. Because if you regulate too much, you're going to kill the industry, because people will be like, wait, that's way too much money I need to put before even signing the contract in regulation, in deorbiting, decommissioning, etc. On the other hand, if you don't regulate at all, that's going to be a huge problem. So now, as you mentioned, there is a lot of initiative regarding soft law. What I noticed recently is that major space powers, such as the US, they spoke about some regulation that they would potentially implement, but they're already working on some sort of guidelines. So that gives a hint. Because the problem is, there is a few major space jurisdictions that needs to actually implement this type of norm in order for them to be internationally impacting. So that's why it's important to have a coordination on this. I know that right now, you have an association of national regulators that are working on guidelines. Regarding the scale, it's difficult to schedule that. It can be 5 years, it can be 10 years. I'm not sure it's going to be below 5 years, because I know that right now you have a lot of regulation in review, but it's a tricky move for a single country to go on the decommissioning, on the debris mitigation, as if on a very lonely. It's not like space resources, which was more like a, hey, let's go invest. This is more a constraint, and you don't want to have forum shopping. So I think it's going to take a few years to have some national law, or my guess is regional treaties starting to implement binding mechanism. Next question, if we have time, as I can see the organizer watching the clock. Any question about the contract, regulations, authorizations? It was super clear?
I have a personal question.
Yes.
What was it in you that wanted to pursue space law?
Wow, okay. Well, you know, every time we see lawyers are just, they're just drafting paper, and they're just, here to put more constraints and more difficulties in in industrial processes. What I like in the space law is that we are dealing in an extremely complicated environment, extremely technical and extremely risky. And what I believe is that as lawyers, we can bring to the industry this, I would not say trust, but this environment where partners can trust each other and mitigate this huge uncertainty you have. That's why we negotiate contracts. And that's why I decided to create these ventures, because I really wanted to help this ecosystem to better negotiate the contract and to feel confident while achieving this type of program. And I see like the Time Master is telling me to cut. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you again so much. And enjoy the Paris Space Week.